Good morning and welcome to the grant writing workshop hosted by Moore. I'm Karen Atkins, project director of Moore, and I work alongside Jerry Allison, Travis Witt, and Alicia Wilhoit. Before I begin, I want to quickly tell you about Moore. Moore falls under the Kentucky Rural Foothills umbrella of services. The agency's Rural Community Opioid Response Program, or RCOR, is a grant that is a consortium of organizations that collectively work together to drive change in how our community responds to the opioid crisis in Madison County. Our three primary goals include prevention, treatment, and recovery. We invite you to connect with us on Facebook. You can learn more about us at foothillscap.org or visit our online resource directory at madisonhelp.org. Our core grant funding is provided by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and their support made today's grant training opportunity available.
Hi, everybody. I'm Travis Witt, and we have a great webinar planned today. Please do not hesitate to engage with us throughout the program. If you have any comments or questions, you can submit them at any time using the Q&A feature, which is somewhere down here. We will also utilize the chat box, and we'll post all of our training related links and documents. Try to stay tuned in, but take breaks as you need them. We will offer a scheduled break around 10:30. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the break and at the end of the workshop, so keep that in mind if you have any questions throughout. Now, I'm very excited to introduce Vickie Johnson. Vickie is Grant Professional Certified, and she received her certification from the Grant Professional Certification Institute. She's worked at victim services and educational nonprofits since 2010 and helped secure more than $6.6 million in competitive grant funding and more than $33 million total from foundations and government entities. She's one of the 12 Kentuckians to have earned the Grant Professional certification, and today she works at the Ohio Valley Educational Cooperative, which is a consortium of 15 school districts which serve more than 155,000 students in North Central Kentucky. Vickie, thank you so much for being here. I'll let you take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Travis. And it's great to see all these people chiming in, saying good morning. I know that we have a lot of different participants today from a lot of different organizations, probably with different areas of expertise. So my hope is that every one of you will get something out of this to make you, to help you with your job, whether that job is in programming or you are a dedicated grant writer or whatever the case may be. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Wanted to make sure that we take a look at what we're going to cover today so that you know what to expect. We're going to talk about grant readiness because there's a lot to do before you ever sit down to start writing. We're going to talk about some strategies for finding funding for your organization and projects. We're going to talk about how you can review the request for proposals, and there's a ton of acronyms for what that might be, but how you review a funding opportunity. We're going to go over application components and some strategies for developing a solid proposal component by component. I'm going to give you a few tips for managing and organizing your work. A lot of it has been learned the hard way by me, and some of it has been learned by mentors and other professionals in the field. And we're going to talk briefly about getting started on implementation and some of those first steps that you'll need to do to launch your project, your grant-funded project. And as Travis mentioned, we'll have a brief Q&A and break about halfway through. So first we have a poll here. I would love to know what brings you here today. And Travis, if you want to go ahead and launch that poll, that would be great. So I know some of you are really interested in pursuing grant writing perhaps, or you're the only person in your organization or department who is responsible for grant writing. Some of you are here because your boss said to be here, and that is perfectly okay too. My hope is that by the end of this 2 hours together that you'll have some ideas, even if you never write a grant, about how you can be a better team member, because grant administrators need a lot of different people because they are not subject area experts and they are not out in the field typically meeting with clients. So even if your boss made you do it or your funding requires it, my hope is that it helps you be a better team member. So what do our responses look like here?
I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Surprisingly, we only have one person whose boss made them do it.
Oh.
So
Karen, was that you?
Actually, no, because as a host, I cannot participate in the poll.
Awesome. Okay, so it looks like about half of you don't write grants but want to understand how to help your team. So that's great. You know, when you get a grant, you're responsible for reporting about the programming, and that ranges from a very simple email to a funder to very complex reports. So the more that program people who are working with clients, working in the field, know about what this process looks like, the better you'll be able to help your team members. Oops. All right. There we go. I just wanted to put this up because I wanted to be clear about what you can expect today and then what this training is not. So it is focused on grants for nonprofit organizations. I know there are some people who are interested in funding for establishing or growing small businesses or for individuals. This is not that. I am not an expert in those subjects. So that's not what we're talking about here today. This is an overview of how to position your organization or your department to successfully seek grants. It's not a magic wand for all your funding needs. I think a solid organization is going to have a diversity of funding sources. So you don't want to rely exclusively on grants anyway. I'm going to offer suggestions of where you might find good funders for your project. But this is not a list of funders that is specific to your project or your organization. You'll have to do your homework. This is based on my 12+ years of experience in grant seeking. This is by no means exhaustive or the only way to do grants. I think if you asked 50 grant professionals how to do something, you'd probably get at least 30 different answers. So this is, you know, based on expertise and learning and experience and mentorship. So if you discover or have a better way of doing something, please feel free to do that. So a little bit about me. I'm not going to read this all to you, but I am a Kentucky native. I was born in Owensboro, but have lived all around the country. I've been working at nonprofits in Kentucky for 12.5 years. I started in a domestic violence coalition. So some of you may have partnerships with the domestic violence program in your area. So you may have interfaced with me in some way without knowing it. I did earn my GPC in 2000, well, I guess it was 2021. So that's one of 2 grant certifications in the country. It is the only one that is accredited by the National Association of Accreditation. That's me and my daughter on a recent trip. She keeps me on my toes. And she is my why. I want the world to be a better place for her. So that's kind of why I do what I do. And as an introvert, grant work is a good way for me to do that. And some of my other jobs are pretty random, but the reason I wanted to point that out is because they're all about problem solving. And I think that if you are a good problem solver and are analytical and can follow instructions and read details, you can write grants. I didn't set out when I finished high school to be a grant writer. I took a pretty meandering path to get where I am. So hopefully if it's something that you want to do, that inspires you, even if it's not in your background. So second poll, and this will help me kind of gauge some of the examples I might offer today. So Travis, if you want to launch that, I'd love to know how much grant seeking experience you have. All right. Let's see what we've got here. All right, so about half of you don't have any. And some have, most of you are going to have less than 2 years experience. So again, I think this is kind of speaking to you, the 5 or it looks like 8 of you who have 5 or more years experience. You may have developed different ways for doing what you do than I'm going to present today. And if there's something that you want to chime in with, some best practice that you have found, feel free to put it in the chat. We'd love to hear from you too. I think a lot of people, grants are a competitive business, of course, but I think that the more that we collaborate, the more that we elevate all of our work. So if you have tips and tricks, feel free to offer those. All right. Let's see. Just some quick basic understandings before we really dig in. Grants are not free money. I think the general public thinks that, and sometimes our executive leaders think that, you have something that you want to fund and you just go out and you look for grant money and it's easy as cake. And why can't we all go to the Gates Foundation and get $2 million? But that is not what it's about. So they're usually to fund specific projects. This is not exclusively true because there is a movement among foundations to offer multi-year general operating support, but that's kind of tricky to come by. So hopefully that's the direction we'll move in the next few years in private funding. But of course, federal state funding, you have a specific project or specific activities and a defined period of performance. So that could be 1 year, it could be 5 years. And there's some examples there are the kinds of projects or funding priorities that a funder might grant awards for. There's a high level of accountability for financial and programmatic performance. This is different than individual fundraising, where your level of accountability, depending on the amount that a person is contributing, is going to differ. So it may be that they want to see through a newsletter where their $50 per month contribution is going. Others might have, more expectations about how you report to them, but grants are going to have a higher level of accountability. There are going to be terms and conditions. Some of them are very brief, but they're really important to understand. And the use of funds is typically restricted. So you'll have unallowable expenses and allowable expenses. As you're reading through to decide to submit an application, that's really important to pay attention to. And I just like this quote, nonprofits are the intermediaries between generosity and social change. And I think that writing grants is a piece of that. We're linking funding, whether it's from foundations and the people that contribute to them or government entities, and we're turning that into social change. So keep that in back of mind. So we're going to dig into grant readiness. As I said, there's a ton to do before you even, I would say, set pen to paper, but that's usually not how we go about these things anymore. Although I am a copious handwritten note taker, so some of us do. But you need to make sure your organizational house is in order. So I have provided a list here of the items that you should always have up to date and easily accessible, because a lot of proposals, if not most proposals, are going to require some or all of these attachments. So you're going to be familiar with most of them. If you have ever been part of a federal grant application, whether that's directly to the feds or to a state or municipality that's using federal funding. And I know in the days of COVID and American Rescue Plan funds, a lot of us have been involved in this where we perhaps weren't before. If that is the case, you'll need a sam.gov registration and a unique entity identifier number. Form 990s, every nonprofit's required to file them, your audits, and there's some very specific rules about that with federal funding, bylaws, board roster, your organizational chart. None of these should come as a surprise, but you do want to have them ready to go and have them updated. I take a look at most of these things at least once a year or once a fiscal year, or if you know your organization, you'll be able to plan when to update these. And some of them are permanent. A 501c3 letter you just need once unless you change your organizational name. Policies and procedures. A lot of times you don't need to have or submit your full policies and procedures, but some funders will ask for excerpts about conflict of interest or about equal employment policies and that sort of thing. Excuse me. So it's good to have those ready and perhaps have those sections highlighted that you frequently have to include in grant applications. Strategic plan, basic information about your service population or area. If you have service area maps, that sort of thing, those could go into an image bank. And so what I mean by that, the image bank and language bank, after you do this long enough, you're going to have, I hesitate to call it stock because you never just want to copy and paste stock language, but you'll know, you'll come up with the best ways to describe your programs and to describe the people that you're working with. And so you want to sort of capture that rather than having to go back and dig through it every time. So I have a language bank by program that has some of the ways that I have found effective to communicate what it is that we do and who we serve. Same thing with images. And then lastly, letters of support. Just a note on that, that is different than letters of commitment. Letters of support might be testimonials from clients, from community partners that are general in nature. So I have worked with XY organization for 10 years and we have done these kinds of projects together, and I have found them to be a generous partner and reliable, and we really believe in the work that they do. It's nice to have a few of those tucked away in case you need them. A letter of commitment is different. It's a commitment to do a specific set of activities or to commit certain things to a project. So those are going to be more specific and usually related to a specific proposal. Okay. So how do you find funding that fits your project and your needs? The first thing you do is you assess what your community needs, because that's always the starting point. And once you have that identified, whether it's through a needs assessment or through just a good understanding of your community, you're going to ask what your organization needs in order to serve the community. Is it additional staffing? Is it additional space to hold recovery groups? Is it new equipment for a playground? So you always start with what your community needs and go from there. Some of the things that make a good fit funder, you want to make sure that your project aligns with the funder's priorities. So they may have a specific area of focus, such as early childhood education or youth mental health. They may have a specific service area focusing on Appalachia or focusing on the Southeastern United States or a 7-county service area or something like that. They may focus on a specific population. Perhaps they fund projects that serve women or serve Black youth or something like that. And then a project type. Some are only project funded, some fund research only, some do capital projects. So you want to make sure that that alignment those priorities fit your project needs too. So then taking a look at the kind of awards that a funder offers. So do the typical award amounts match your organization's needs? If you are trying to install a small playground at a park, a funder whose typical awards are $300,000 might not be the best fit. You may be looking to cobble together more than that, although I know some playgrounds are very, very expensive. So just make sure that those award amounts that you see the funder offering match the needs. But does the timing of the award cycle meet your organization? Excuse me. You know, a lot of foundations particularly might offer multiple award cycles throughout a year. So, and some of them focus on specific priorities. For example, they may have their education proposals due in December and their performing arts proposals due in March. So does the timing of that cycle meet your organization's needs? If you need something 3 months from now, it's going to be a struggle, I would say, to get grant funding in that period of time. So this is a long-term game. It's not instant money for sure. So make sure that that fits. And then can you implement the project with the funding restrictions? If you have a project that relies heavily on personnel and you're applying for a lot of grants that don't pay for salary, you're going to put yourself in a bind unless you have solid funding to pay the staff to run the program. So just be mindful of that. And then lastly, does your organization have the capacity to meet the funder's expectations for reporting and accountability? If your funder requires in-depth research and you don't have data collection processes in place, you don't have someone who focuses on evaluation, you need to really assess whether or not you're ready to carry out that project if you are in fact funded. And there are ways to accommodate some of those, that you just want to be sure that you're asking that question. Okay. So again, grant funding is intended to help organizations create, expand, test, or improve projects and programs that meet community needs. Again, there are exceptions. If you have to contort yourself to meet for your organization or your project to align with a funder's priorities, it's not a good fit. And it probably won't lead to a successful program or one that meets your community's needs. Just be sure that your program and the mission priorities of the foundation or government entity you're applying to are in alignment. So don't be the guy that's chasing money. You can get into a real bind that way, both financial and perhaps owing money back, which is something we never want to do in the grants world. Okay, so you kind of know what you want to find funding for. It's time to develop a prospects list. So foundations and other entities and this could apply to potential individual donors as well. But you want to create a routine. So there are paid subscription services that do these searches for you, but usually by keyword, organizational type, and so on. I know that spreadsheets kind of get, I don't know, laughed at sometimes, but depending on the size of your organization, you may not be in a position to pay for one of these subscription services. And I keep a spreadsheet. I change it frequently, but these are generally the kinds of information that I keep on my spreadsheets. So, the second to last item there is that a good fit at the time of most recent research. So I'm always putting the date on there that I most recently researched that funding source. So if I researched a foundation today, I'm going to make note of that. And maybe I go back and check out this list a year from now and say, it's been a year since I researched that foundation. I wonder what might have changed. So either the priority areas might have changed. They may be looking at different geographic areas, and so on. So it's important to kind of have that information, even if at first they don't seem like the exact right fit. You want to revisit that. Okay, and then so places to seek or to look for corporate, family, and community foundation funding. Again, there are paid subscription search services that range pretty dramatically in cost. Grant Station, I'll point out, is if you're a member of the Grant Professionals Association, I'm going to put in a plug here. I sit on their board for the state chapter. It's a national organization that I find incredibly valuable because this is my full-time work. There's so much experience in there. But Grant Station is part of the membership of the Grant Professionals Association. So you do get access to that database. Foundation Directory Online, all of these have monthly or annual subscriptions. Instrumental is relatively new on the scene, but I've heard a lot of people that really like it. It has search functions, but also grant management functions. And then your good old fashioned web search. A lot of corporations, banks, and credit unions that might offer funding, their websites are going to be the best place to go, or establish relationships, talk to the bank manager. If there's a community engagement department or contact person in a corporation, network with them. So corporations, you might look for corporate social responsibility pages, community engagement, and you might find some information there. This is also a good way to look for volunteers if that's part of your program plan. You can also spend time poring over annual reports and newsletters of organizations that have a similar mission or similar programming. So I just captured this screenshot of an organization. This was on their website. They even have it segmented for you. So this is just a portion of their funders that contributed more than $5,000. So you can see some of the foundations, and I actually don't remember what organization this was, but for the sake of argument, let's just say it's a performing arts organization. So I can see here that Anthem, Brown-Forman, GE, the Geens Foundation, all of these are funding performing arts. So I might want to dig into those foundations or funders and learn more about them and what they do, and if we might be a viable candidate for funding. And I don't know how many of you, I should have made this a poll question, how many of you have looked at Form 990s, the IRS form that is required, each private foundations are required to file every year. I admit to being a bit of a geek, and I really enjoy looking at these. So Travis is raising his hand. Yeah, I spend more time with these than I probably should because I'm a little bit strange, but they can be really a wealth of information about foundations that you're considering. So I'm just going to go through a few of the sections that might be especially beneficial for you. So this is just your basic information. This is publicly available, so I'm not spilling any beans here. This is especially useful if you're not paying for a search service. So there's a telephone number there. Their employer identification number can be useful to you as well. Tells you where they're located. And then we move on to Part 8. So this is a list of their board members and some interesting information about their compensation. But this can be useful because your executive leadership or your board of directors may have connections to some of these people. And if they do, you want to point that out and maybe encourage some cultivation with this foundation. Part 15. So this is the part of the 990 that tells you how to apply for funding, gives you some of the details about how they fund organizations. So you can see here, there's in number 2, it says, check here if the foundation only makes contributions to pre-selected charitable organizations and does not accept unsolicited requests for funds. So smaller family foundations, a lot of times that box will be checked. They frequently contribute to the same organizations year after year after year because typically their board is made up of family members and they have particular causes that they feel passionately about and continue to fund those. However, it's still worth looking to see if there might be connections between your board and their board. They may still be interested in knowing about your project, but I would say only if it is very well aligned with the other organizations that they appear to fund. So you have contact information here for a person who you'd want to talk to about submitting proposals if you have any questions. This tells me that there's an online application and where to find it. Tells me about deadlines. This is one that they have 3 or 4 different priority areas and they just have different deadlines throughout the year. And then any restrictions or limitations on awards. So you're going to find a lot of information here that's going to help you know whether or not to pursue funding from that foundation. And then this is still part of section 15 or part 15. This is the list of contributions that this foundation made during 2019. So looking at this, I see that they are funding a lot of different organizations. Americana Community Center, I know, serves a lot of immigrants and refugees. Red Cross is there. 21st Century Parks is very different than those two. Tells you how much. It tells you how much they're funding each of those organizations. And this one is particularly helpful because it tells you the purpose of the grant or contribution. Frankly, they're not often that detailed. So this is especially helpful. It tells you they do offer general operating support. So depending on how long this list is, I will look at averaging what those award amounts are and try to eliminate any clear outliers so that I know, they do, let's say 30 awards per year and they average about $12,000. So if I do decide that this is a good fit funder, I know what to ask for. So moving on to government funding. These are trickier. So here are some places that you would look for government funding for your project. Grants.gov, I'm sure any of you who have done federal grants, I would hope, are familiar with this. And I'll go into detail on some of these. The Federal Register, websites for the different federal departments. And if you're really into grant seeking, if that is your dedicated job, following the federal budget process can help you predict a little bit what's to come down the pike. It's an imperfect process, and as I'm sure most of you know, the budgeting process seems to lag and take forever. So it's a little bit of a moving target, but I work for an educational nonprofit, so we're always monitoring the Department of Education budget for any changes, anything that looks different, anything that might give us clues as to what they are prioritizing in the next few years. And then unfortunately, Kentucky, we don't have a centralized grant opportunities listing for the state government. So you'll have to go to different cabinet and department websites. And I will say for both federal and state government, if you're looking at departmental websites, there is a wide difference in how effective they are. Some are so hard to find any information on grants that you'd rather pull your hair out. And some of them are very clear and easy and have a lot of supplemental material and make it really easy to find that information. So you just kind of have to look around and dig where you can. So grants.gov, this is one place to look for federal funding. You go to the search grants tab. There's a keyword there. If you get familiar with the projects you're looking to fund, for example, we have Head Start programs where I work. So I know this, the CFDA, which is the catalog of federal, oh goodness, I'm losing the acronym. It's a specific number for a specific funded program. So I can go up there and type in the CFDA for Head Start programs and see if there is anything new forecasted that I might want to pay attention to. And here's the same thing. I'm just pointing out sort of how highly customizable that search function is. So you can, by eligibility, different categories. You can see I've checked HRSA there. And it looks like they have some competitions that are forecasted. So those are not officially posted yet. It's also helpful sometimes to look at closed opportunities because you might get an idea of, hey, I think we're a good fit for this federal program, but I haven't seen anything about it for a while. So if you look at closed or archived opportunities, you might see a pattern that, oh, okay, well, I know they always come out in November, so you can start planning. Doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to come out this November, but it'll give you some clues about what to look for. So the Federal Register. This is a listing of all official government documentation goes on here. And it is updated daily at 8:45. So if you remember, I said to create a routine with your prospecting, usually between 8:45 and 10 a.m. There are several lists that I look at. I look at our state Department of Ed to see if they have any new competitions out. I look at our federal education department to see if there's anything new. And I look at the Federal Register because it updates at 8:45. There's a section, the special filing are things that are going to come out today or tomorrow or the next few days. And the regular filing are things that are published today. So if there's a funding opportunity that is filed, in this case, it was 6/23, and you can see that it was due to be published on 6/24. So you know that it's coming up, you want to get ready. There's a PDF, sometimes that's a draft if it's a forecasted opportunity. There's also when rules and regulations about a specific program change, you might want to look there. Reporting requirements, you can find that if there are changes coming up, and you can find all of that in the Federal Register. And then again, examples of departmental websites. I have never applied for HRSA funding, but it looks like they have a pretty robust grant section of their website. Department of Justice, I've spent a lot of time on there. So they also have some good information, though it's a little bit disjointed. You kind of have to know what you're looking for. Then let's see, I'm just doing a quick time check. Looks like we have a couple of questions, and we are in about 25 minutes or so going to open the floor up for questions. So we can hold off on those. That would be great. Actually, let me go back. So reviewing opportunities. So you found some grant opportunities that you think you might want to apply for that appear to be a good fit. So what do you do next? You review those opportunities. You found the funder and maybe just identified an opportunity. Now you're going to dig in and see if it truly is the right fit for you. And the first thing you're going to do is look at your eligibility. If you're not eligible to apply for a specific HRSA grant, then you might want to stop there and not spend a ton of time investigating it. Now you might, because you might want to see if you could be a good partner for another application. There's some other information in those RFPs that that might be useful to you. So these are some eligibility issues that might kick you out of eligibility. A type of entity. So there are funding sources that, especially within education, that are only going to fund institutes of higher education, or they're only going to fund the state education agency, which is our state department of it, or education cabinet. Some are looking specifically at a service area. Some programs or some specifically government funding is only looking at new grantees. Some of them are only looking at continuation grantees because they want to maybe scale a project that they've already funded. And then a little anecdotal story, the organizational budget issue and the type of entity has come up for me in the work that I currently do. I work for OVEC, the Ohio Valley Educational Cooperative. We are a nonprofit organization, but we are not a 501c3. However, we have an affiliate foundation that is a 501c3. OVEC, which is not the 501c3, has a considerably large organizational budget, but the foundation does not. So there are a few opportunities that I've looked at where we fall in that trap about the funder will only fund 501c3s. So that kicks the cooperative out. So now we're looking at the foundation, but they only want organizational budgets over 250,000, say. Well, we don't fit that. So that's not an opportunity that's going to work for us. So some are looking at new nonprofits. Some want to see a long track record of your work in the communities. And some are looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations. For example, they may require that your board be a majority people of color. They may require that your board have at least one person with lived experience in whatever kind of programming you're trying to do for, like, homelessness, for example. I know that some HUD applications require that there be a board member who has experienced homelessness. So if you are eligible, keep reading. If you're not, you can ask some questions. It doesn't mean you're never going to be eligible. I mean, it could, but not necessarily. So is the reason you're not eligible something that's changeable? Let's say it's that departmental budget issue. We know that over the last couple of years with the pandemic, our budgets have looked maybe different than they typically would. So let's say your organizational, your most recent organizational or operations budget is lower than the threshold the foundation is looking for. It may be worthwhile to have a conversation with that foundation to say, here's why it's lower than that threshold. But you can see the track record over the last 5 to 10 years that typically we would be eligible, but because of COVID, because we weren't able to have our annual fundraiser and so on, we don't meet that threshold now. Could we still apply? So just have a conversation with that foundation if it's a situation like that. Or could you be a strong partner to another primary applicant? So I work a lot with school districts, and sometimes there is funding that we are not eligible for, but a district would be. So we might contract with that district to offer the training for the grant that they're applying for. So figure out how you collaborate in your community. And if you come across something that, if you're organization A and organization B looks like they might be a good fit for them, then pass it on. We do that quite a lot with universities. I think that we have a little bit more capacity in our development department to review funding opportunities. So a lot of times I'll put a summary together and send it to one of our university partners and say, hey, we're not eligible for this, but you are. Is there anybody in your department that's interested in looking at this? And then maybe you'll be eligible next year. Priorities change. And again, when we're talking about a prospects list, I urge you to revisit some of the ones that you were not eligible for one reason or another, but look like they might be a good fit. All right, and you also want to consider, is it a good fit at this time? So priorities, we've talked about matching priorities of your organization or project with that of a funder. But you also want to look at the priorities. This is particularly true in federal funding. Absolute priorities, you must address those in your proposal. So those could be, it could be an absolute priority, for example, that you have to somehow have a clear plan for underrepresented populations in your project. Competitive priorities are basically going to get you extra credit. So those might be, if you're a rural provider, this competition is going to prioritize those. It doesn't mean that urban providers are not eligible and won't be considered for funding, but rural projects would get priority. So then your opportunity details. We talked before about foundations and what their award amounts typically are. So now we're talking about a specific opportunity. So for example, again, a federal opportunity in the request for proposals or RFP, and I'll go over some of the various acronyms for the same thing here in a little bit, but they're going to tell you that there are, we anticipate awarding 20 grants, and that those grants are going to range between $300,000 and $500,000. So you then would want to see if you can figure out who past grantees are. If there's 20 awards this year, and it looks like a good fit, but all of the past awardees are colleges and universities, and you're not, chances are that's not a great fit. That's not always true. It's worth taking a look. But a lot of times you'll also see we're going to issue, let's say, 3 awards of $2 million each. And those are all universities or consortiums or something like that. That's a very, very targeted. And a lot of times those are for technical assistance centers. They may be for conferences and so on. So those are probably not a good fit unless you are those grantees in the past. So take a deeper look, but that probably is not going to be a great fit. And then again, does the timeline work? Do you have time to prepare a competitive application? I know any of us who have done this before, I'm sure have had situations where something comes through your email and it's like, hey, we should apply for this. And you look and it's like, well, the deadline's in 3 days. So you have a big decision to make. If all it requires is a letter requesting funds, you can probably pull that off. You also have to consider any internal processes. School districts, for example, usually have a pretty lengthy process for getting approval from district superintendents and so on. So you have to think about, with your organizational policies, do you have time to work it through the chain of command and create a competitive proposal? And then grant funding is expecting more and more community partnerships and collaboration, which I think is a great thing. It's a tricky thing, and that's a whole different training. But in terms of your timeline, you want to think about whether any required partnerships are already established, or do they need cultivation? Do you need to spend the next year before this opportunity is up again, working with those partners to establish a plan, to establish some common programming, and so on? So once I figured that out, I create an opportunity summary for the decision makers, because I am not a decision maker in my organization. And judging just from the number of people on here, I'm guessing most of you are not decision makers either. So here's some of the information that I would include on an opportunity summary. And this should all be stuff that is going to go through with a pretty quick initial overview of an opportunity. You may need to read through it to get this information, but you should be able to put this together pretty quickly. And then if you get the go ahead, if the decision makers in your organization say, yeah, that looks like something that we might want to take a look at, then you're going to go back and you're going to really dig into that proposal. Now, I say this, I do a lot of federal proposals, so it can take a few read throughs to really get your mind wrapped around what they're asking for. I've worked on a couple of National Science Foundation proposals recently that I've had to read through several times because it's not my area of expertise. But there may be small family foundations where it's, give us a summary about your organization, give us a summary about your project, tell us how much funding you need and for what. So whatever those details are, just make sure you really have a good understanding of them. And this is where you're going to start making notes and using highlighters and starting your outline so that you can actually start writing your proposal. So you're going to look for key programmatic requirements. Again, those might be framed as those absolute or competitive priorities. Formatting requirements. What's your page limit? What's your character limit? What font is required? That sort of information. Really dig into the details, because sometimes you have a pretty tight page limit, but you'll read, and it's supposed to be double spaced, but you'll read that tables can be single spaced and 10-point font rather than 12-point font. Now that does not mean you need to fill your entire 15 pages with tables so that you can get more verbiage on there. You don't want to overuse things like that, but there may be ways in that formatting requirement. Bulleted lists are a good way to sort of save some space, but pay attention to those formatting requirements, because getting that wrong can kick you out of a competition. Budget requirements and limitations. This is, again, some are saying we're not going to pay for administrative costs. We're not going to pay for salary. Be very familiar with those limitations, because the last thing you want to do is get a grant and read something and be like, oh, we really wanted to do this other thing with this $10,000. We wanted to pay part of a salary. But I overlooked the part that said we don't pay for personnel, because then you're going to have to call your funder and work through that. Transparency is key in a situation like that, to say, we had a change in what we need to do. Could we use the funding for this other thing? You're also going to look for required and prohibited attachments. Some funders will say, don't give us any attachments, just answer our questions and call it a day. Others are going to have a really, really long list of required attachments, and you need to be familiar with those. This is one of those things where every new federal funder, especially, I'm reminded that I really need to take a close look at those attachments well in advance. Again, National Science Foundation had a lot of attachments that were required that I was unfamiliar with. So it's important to really dig into those early in your process so that you can get the information that you need. And then lastly, what is needed from your team? Again, you want to do this as early as possible. You want to create a list of information that you need from your finance folks, your community partners, your program staff. You want to build in internal deadlines. You know, these are the ones that I have in my head that are not necessarily on my calendar invites sometimes, but, you know, internal deadlines about when you start asking follow-up questions and that sort of thing. Just make sure that you give yourself enough time to ask for clarification, for additional detail, or for somebody to revise their section if they're writing a section of a grant. I'm guessing, again, that most of you are not dedicated grant writers. I think a lot of us end up doing programs and someone sees that we either have an affinity or are good at writing grants, and so we end up in that role. But we can't be subject matter experts in everything. So you really have, this is a team effort, and you really have to rely on finance people. I am not an accountant. I can put together a budget, but I'm always going to want a second look from someone in our finance team. I am not an expert in providing professional development for teachers. So I have a lot of conversations about what that looks like so that I can write competitive proposals to get funding for that. So you can't be everything and rely on your team. And again, for those of you who answered that you don't write grants, but you want to know how to be a better team member, this is one of the ways that you can be a better team member. If the person who is writing grants in your organization needs information for a proposal or for a report, hopefully today, after today, you'll have a better understanding of what they're working on so that you can provide information in a timely way, and you can provide accurate information and complete information. So at that point, you're ready to take all that information and start writing. So we're a little ahead of 10:30. But this is where I have a break built in. So if you need to take a break, stand up and stretch, step away from your computer. If you have any questions, that would be great. I see there's 3 in the Q&A. And I don't know if any, you know, if Travis or Karen, if you've gotten any additional ones, but let's go ahead and take a look at the Q&A. So Roxanne asks, based on what you need to have, if you're just starting out, do you have to wait 2 years to request a grant? I think that makes sense. If you're a startup organization, it's going to depend on the funder. There are a lot of funders out there now. It's also going to depend on what you do. A lot of funders are focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, social justice, racial justice issues right now. And there is recognition that those kinds of organizations may not have the same capacity as, say, a community action agency or an educational cooperative that's been in existence for a long time. So if it's that kind of funder, you may not need those 2 years. Usually what they want to see is some sort of record of good financial stewardship. And sometimes that can take a while. Or they may be a collaborative grant maker where they say, you know, you're a grassroots organization. We want to help you build this organization. We have the capacity as a foundation to help you build this organization. So we might award you $15,000 to get your policies and procedures done, or to have some strategic planning or something like that. So you don't necessarily have to wait 2 years. You need to look at the eligibility requirements. And it's okay to talk to funders. I mean, there are some that will say, don't call and don't email. But by and large, picking up the phone and saying, hey, this is what we do. We just got our 501c3 a couple of months ago. This is our standing in the community. This is the work we've been doing. But we don't have 2 years worth of audits yet, for example. Can you help us understand how we might partner with your foundation and get funding into the community to meet these needs? So Roxanne, I hope that answers your question. Feel free to chime in if it doesn't, if you had follow-up questions. So, okay, someone is asking, saying they're not 100, great, thanks Roxanne. Someone is not clear, but asking how grant writers get paid. Is compensation based on a percentage of the grant awarded? This is a really great question. So ethical grant writers do not get paid based on a percentage of the grant awarded for many reasons, one of which most grants explicitly prohibit, and all federal grants do, that funding be used for fundraising efforts. So if you have a federal grant, it does not go to grant writers. The other reason is that, excuse me, that it sets up a really tricky precedent, because grant funding is supposed to be used for current costs. Grant writing is something that happens before your project begins. So you can't use it to pay for past costs. It also creates a really, you know, a potential situation where people are not getting paid for their work. You know, I might spend 40 hours on a federal grant, and just for the sake of argument, let's say it was allowed to pay a grant writer out of that funding. If it's not awarded, should I not get paid for those 40 hours? That's not a fair situation. It's just not ethical. It's against actually the code of ethics for the Grant Professionals Association, and also for, forgetting the acronym again, for the professional fundraisers too. So grant writers are funded usually out of unrestricted funds. So in our case, for example, our school districts there's a membership fee to be part of our cooperative for the 15 school districts that we serve. So those go into general operating funds. And so that's where my salary gets paid. Could be out of fundraising. There could be, you know, it could be that there's an individual donor who wants to help you build capacity because they believe in what you do. And if you tell them this is how we can build capacity, they might fund a grant writer on a contract basis. But if you're engaged with or talking to a grant writer who says that they, you know, take 5% of all funding that's awarded, that's a big red flag. Let's see. Do you have to be a certified grant writer to request a grant? No. I did not get my certification until last year, but I've been doing this for about a little over 12 years. So you definitely do not have to be. I mean, there are a lot of organizations that don't have the capacity for a full-time grant writer or even a contract grant writer. They're relying on an executive director or sometimes someone in their accounting team, or sometimes a volunteer board member to start writing grants for them. So absolutely, you don't have to be certified to do this. Grant writers are intended to be sort of out of the picture. So, you know, there are some cases where a funder might know that, for example, that the organization is using a contract grant writer. But the grant writer shouldn't be central in any proposal. It should be the organization and what the organization proposes to do. So whether or not that grant writer is certified or not shouldn't matter. It matters to me because it's the certification process. I learned a lot through the process, but I also, I think it lends credibility to what I do. I do some consulting. The certification program that I did requires a certain number of years of experience, and there's a written exam, and I think a 4-hour multiple choice exam. So it really shows, it's really evidence that I know what I'm doing when it comes to a variety of grant situations. So Stephanie asks or says, I'm willing to volunteer to start learning the grant writing process located in Lexington. Is it possible to sit on a board to learn whatever it takes? I'm not sure, Stephanie, if you mean like an organizational board, or I know that I mentioned that I'm on the board of the Kentucky chapter of Grant Professionals Association. I'm not sure if that's what you meant. If you could clarify, I'd be happy to answer. In the meantime, I was just trying to learn anything to get started. Okay. I think the Grant Professionals Association is a great place to get started. There's an annual membership fee to join. We do have a Kentucky chapter, but there is so much expertise in that group. Again, I don't know how many members, but we have our annual conference coming up in Louisville. So that's in November 3rd through 5th, I think. So last year that conference was in Seattle. This year it's in Louisville. So if you're able to attend that, I mean, there's so much information there. It's a really great experience. And it's not just for grant writers, it could be that you're administrating grant funded projects. So it would be for you as well. It could be that you want to start consulting, or that you work for an organization, or even if you work for a grant maker. There's a lot of great sessions there. So I'm going to put in a chat, not two W's, I'm going to put the link to their website, and I would start there. Nicole, if you go to that website I just put in the chat, there's a ribbon bar thing up at the top, and it eventually will scroll by information about the conference. So yeah, we're excited to have that in our backyard. I think next year it's in Denver, and then the following year in Kansas City. So I'm glad you asked that question, because if you're interested in pursuing this as a career, or if it's even 30% of your job, it's a really worthwhile conference. And let's see. Karen, have there been any questions that came up in the chat that I haven't addressed? I see another one in the Q&A.
Looking for you. Vickie, there's one question that just came in, but I think just for the sake of time, let's address that at the end and go ahead and take our small break.
Okay, that sounds great.
What time do you want us to meet you back here? It is 10:32.
32. Let's be back at 10:40.
10:40. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Thanks, everybody. All right, I'm going to go ahead and dive back in here. I did see a couple more questions come in, and I would like to save those to the end if that's okay. I just want to make sure we get through all of the material. First, I put a couple of other websites in the chat box. The National Grants Management Association is there. So they are focused more on post-award issues of implementation, compliance, that sort of thing. And then the Association of Fundraising Professionals. So that's going to be not specifically grant seeking. I mean, that obviously is a part of fundraising, but this is also going to look at other forms of individual, major gifts, that sort of thing. So those are worth checking out. There's training opportunities offered by both of those entities, a lot of resources on their websites, and they all also offer certification. All right, so I'm going to move on to application components. Okay. First thing you need to do is going to be to identify need. Now, there are as many different application formats as there are funders. Some of them are going to be online portals. Some just request a two-page letter describing your project and your organization and what your request is for. Federal grants, as any of you who have written them know, there are usually multiple portals that you have to submit different pieces of information in. So you really need to figure out early on in your process what it looks like. Somewhere on here, I have a note, I think it's actually at the end, but I'm going to mention it now. If you are using some sort of online grant portal, get on that portal as early as possible. Like as soon as you know that you're going to apply for a funding opportunity, go in and explore that portal. You don't want to be caught at the last minute with a drop-down menu that gives you options that you don't understand or that you can't answer. But it's 11 p.m. and nobody is around to ask. That may or may not happen from time to time. So just make sure you're really familiar with that grant portal. Sometimes you can't move on to a next page unless you've filled out information. So, one thing that I have done, I'm only recommending it because I haven't found another option, is to put in dummy information. So if you go through those fields and put TBD, 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 it's just so that you can move on to the next page and see what those questions are and what's going to be expected of you. You'll be much better prepared to complete your application. Now you have to be very careful if you do that to go back and reset everything. So a word of caution on that strategy, but I have not found a way around it, unfortunately. So if anybody else has, feel free to chime in. Again, I know many of you have written grants. So if there are things that you have found to be true, then please offer your wisdom as well. So need, again, you're going to start with all of these with what does your community need? Why do they need what you're proposing? A good statement of need is going to tell a story and appeal to the emotions of readers. A lot of what we do is kind of about tugging on heartstrings. That said, you don't want to use language that is overly emotional. You need to be factual and let the evidence speak for itself. You want to use testimonials and stories to connect with reviewers, but always be mindful of confidentiality. Having worked in victim services, and I know that many of you work in mental health or substance use, confidentiality is always paramount. One thing you can do is sort of create sort of a composite person who has common elements of stories that you hear. You can always use alternate names or tell a story anonymously. You just want to be careful about identifying information. We write a lot of grants that fund projects for kids. We do have, most of the kids in our Head Start classrooms have signed waivers. So we may have actual stories and actual photos of kids engaged with something that we're requesting funding for. So but we would never do that without a waiver signed by a parent. So again, center the needs of the people being served or the community being served, not the needs of your organization. Those should be secondary. You're trying to position your organization to meet the needs of the people or the community. Seems like my arrows on my keyboard work about half of the time. So there we go. So you want to connect stories to data. So I've given an example here. Substance use programs are not my area of expertise. So I've said, if I've said something in this example that is inaccurate, please forgive me. But this is an example of a way to blend story and data. So I've used a fictional person, but I think her story is fairly typical. I said when she became pregnant, she was struggling with an opioid addiction and afraid of having her child removed by Child Protective Services. And then I used data. Alcohol and drug abuse are conditions in almost 40% of child removals. And without our services and treatment referral network, her worst fears may have come true. So that's one way to do that. I think you're really painting a picture if you do that, but it's also based in evidence. So you're going to describe the population you're going to serve by geography, demographics, economics, health outcome, availability of services. Those are all elements in a statement of need. And you want to use the most localized and current data you can find. If you have a small foundation that serves 5 counties in southeastern Kentucky, but you're using nationwide data, it's going to be very different than what those 5 counties in the southeastern corner of Kentucky look like. So it's not going to be relevant. And you want to cite where your data is coming from. So you want to be careful of that. You might want to look at zip code data or county data. You might want to look at the national data for comparison's sake, but to describe your community, use the most localized information you can find. And also use current data. There are cases that maybe the research hasn't been done in 5 years or that sort of thing. And you can explain that. You can also explain, let's say if there was a trend upward, but the most recent data is from 5 years ago, but the conditions, the situation hasn't changed for the population you're describing. You could say why you would expect that trend is continuing, or what anecdotal evidence you might have that trend from 5 years ago that is continuing today, or why it might have plateaued. So again, you can use comparisons. You can compare population groups, compare geographies, compare neighboring zip codes, etc. That's going to help a reviewer understand the picture in your community and why it has needs that are different than the next community. Use visual representations of data. 15 pages of single-spaced type is really hard for anybody to read, even people at National Science Foundation or HRSA. So use charts, tables, graphs, photos, if it's allowable. Some of them explicitly say that it's not. And you also don't want to overuse. You don't want to make it clear that you're trying to do that to get around any page limitations. But they are, charts and tables can be a really clear way to compile a lot of information. This list obviously is not anywhere near exhaustive, but these are some good sources of data for your needs section. And you want to use that to, to combine with stories and just paint a really full picture for reviewers of what the need really is in your community. One thing I want to point out, the Census Bureau, I don't know if they have a schedule on their website or not, but they have, over the last couple of years, been offering some free webinars about how to use their data tables, their data search functions. They've been really helpful. So you might want to check out their website and see if those are available, or if there are any more coming up. That might be something that I know a lot of you are with community action agencies. It might be something that your parent organization could look into hosting. So just might want to investigate there if you're unfamiliar with how to use their data website. And I love this quote by Brene Brown. I think this really sort of gets at the heart of what you want to do in your proposals. Stories are data with a soul. I mean, I'm someone who loves digging into data and looking for patterns and looking for trends. But the data in and of itself is sort of meaningless. You need to put the story with it. Put the soul behind it so that you really are showing what people need in your community. So we're going to move on to goals and objectives. These can sometimes be tricky. They're going to fall in different places in different proposals. Sometimes there might be a very clearly laid out section that this is where we want to hear about your goals and objectives. Sometimes they're embedded in a program description. Sometimes they might show up in the form of a logic model. So this is where you're going to describe the anticipated results of your project and tell funders what you're going to do with their contribution. Your goal statement should be aspirational, it should be ambitious, it should state the ideal outcome. You don't want to include details about your activities here. So I've included a couple of examples. I'll say this about goal statements. None of us are running programs, whether it's substance use, peer-to-peer programming, or Head Start programs. We're not running them just to run the programs. We're running them because we think they are getting us further toward a goal. So what is that goal? You know, for Head Start, for example, that goal might be that every child in our service area enters kindergarten and takes their kindergarten assessment and they are deemed ready for kindergarten. They've learned the things that they need to learn to be ready for school. For substance use, if it's a prevention program that you're working on, it might be that, you know, our vision is that someday we won't need to do this, that substance use will not be I mean, it's a tricky one. I know that substance use is likely, it's always been there and always will, but that some of the barriers are going to be different, or that trauma-informed care is routine and exists in all places in our society. So think about those big picture goal statements. And then when you've identified the need, so parents struggle to access intensive outpatient treatment in the community because there are no affordable childcare options. We all know that's a big barrier that's become even bigger in the last couple of years. And you have a goal that all residents can access intensive outpatient treatment. So your objectives are what bridge those two things. So you want to be thinking about, how do we get from that need to our goal? And it could be that, you know, our organization by itself is never going to reach that goal, but we can claim one piece of it and work toward that. Or it could be that we engage a multitude of community partners to work toward that goal, and that's part of what we're seeking funding for. Sorry, I just want to, okay. So SMART objectives, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. So they need to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So I've seen different words associated with the acronym, but they're all generally get at the same thing. So a couple of examples there. Within 6 months, we will establish MOUs with local childcare providers that allow for 10 children to attend childcare where their parents are in intensive outpatient treatment. So I've given a time. I've said what we're going to do. It's very specific. Said who we're going to do it with and for how many children. It's relevant because it helps move us from the need to the goal. It's attainable. I think that, you know, given the time frame that we're looking at and what our community looks like and how many providers there are, I think we can do it. And I can measure that. I can say when I've accomplished that. Or within 3 years, 75 individuals will complete our parenting class series designed for parents participating in IoT. Again, it's specific, it's measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So your project description, in whatever form it takes, whether it includes logic models or bulleted lists of goals and objectives, these are the questions. I'm sure all of us are familiar with them who've ever done any sort of writing. These are the questions that they're going to ask. How are you going to achieve your objectives? What are the activities? Who are the participants? Who are your partners? How often is an intervention going to be offered? At what point in your program is that intervention offered? Where is it happening? Not just it's happening in Richmond, Kentucky, but participants live in the city limits of Richmond, and we're going to offer after school tutoring at X, Y, and Z sites. And then why do you think your intervention is going to work? What evidence do you have? Is it because a similar program in a community that resembles yours has proven successful and you'd like to implement it in your community? That might be why you think your intervention is going to work. And then if we, Travis, if we could launch the third and last poll question, I'm wondering how people feel about logic models. And I ask this question for a very specific reason that I will tell you once we get these responses. Tanya, I think that you mean the resources that the National Grants Management Association, AFP Global, those are the other websites I was encouraging you to check out. And I will, well, we're getting those poll responses. I'll put them in here.
People are still responding, and I'm going to give them a second because these results are really interesting to me. So,
okay, great. Okay, I thought I typed those in there.
Vickie, this is Karen. You did, and I've copied them into a Word document, and so I will send that out with the follow-up email later.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, yeah, these are. So 41% wouldn't know a logic model if it said hello to you on the street. Okay. I'm surprised that only 4 of you responded that they make you cringe. And a lot of people who are sort of ambivalent about it, it looks like. I asked this question because even like 5 years into my grant writing experience, every time I would be asked to work on a logic model, I would like break out in hives. I'm prone to exaggeration slightly, but I hated them. I still find them difficult. So I probably would be in that with the 20 of you that find them difficult but useful. But I have found that they really help you hone in on what is it that your project is going to look at. So I work with a client on a freelance basis that is fairly new to grant seeking. And I've encouraged them to put together logic models about each of their program areas, because I really think it helps you identify like what you have the capacity to do, what you want to build the capacity to do, what you're bringing to the table. So again, I think they're difficult but useful. Some requests for proposals require them, but I would encourage you, even if it's just on your own, if you're sort of venturing out to do grant writing on a even remotely regular basis, to give it a shot and try to put your project into some of these typical logic model boxes. So here are some of the typical elements of the logic model. And again, different funders will want this in a different format. I know the Kellogg Foundation has a lot of really good resources on logic models, but there are a million different ways that they can look, but they have the same basic ingredients. And so they're sort of like a recipe. They've got ingredients. That's what you've got in your cabinet, what you're bringing to the process, the steps, how are you going to carry it out? And then your output is the dish. So you know what you're going to get in the end or what you expect to get. So as a little bonus, you get a recipe of my grandmother's cranberry casserole, which is really great at the holidays. So, but that's the logic model in a nutshell right there. So when you're looking at inputs, what do you bring to the table? Do you have a really solid core of volunteers? Do you have a large training room with technology and the capacity to host 100 people or 200 people at a time? Do you have transportation that could be useful in carrying out your project? What are you bringing to the table? In your activities, what are you going to do during the implementation? Are you going to hold trainings? Are you having peer groups? Are you distributing Narcan? Outputs are going to be the evidence that you're doing what you said that you would do. How many people did you train? How many peer groups did you hold? How many unique individuals benefited from your service or program? And then your outcomes are the results. So you may be doing pre and post, pre-service surveys and post-service surveys, or you may be looking at health outcomes that you would get from medical records, careful of confidentiality issues and HIPAA, of course, but the outcomes are what are the results of what you've done? So, sorry, I'm gonna back up a minute. So again, I think thinking through these, whether they're required for a grant that you're submitting or not, I think that thinking through these things really helps you develop a good program that's not just kind of some free form whack-a-mole kind of program. It helps you stay in line and make sure that you're really sort of staying tuned into the mission or the purpose of your organization or department. So there's usually an evaluation section. How are you going to know if your project is successful? And sometimes this is really simple, and it can be, satisfaction surveys from clients. Sometimes it's quantitative data driven. You might want to ask, is there data that's already collected or available that's going to help you determine success? I would encourage you to consider a combination of qualitative and quantitative data that's available. Think through ways to do formative evaluation. So over, let's say, a 3-year project period, are there points at which you could hold focus groups and really determine if the program that you are offering is meeting your client's needs? And if it's not, can you change it? And should you change it? And then summative is going to determine whether or not your intervention helped you achieve your objectives and goals. With this, you really want to consider any internal protocols. A lot of educational institutions are going to have institutional review boards. There are confidentiality requirements about identifying data and so on. So just be considerate of those. And then a couple of examples here about how you might frame an evaluation section. This would probably be in a foundation proposal. Federal proposals tend to be a little bit more detailed and technical on the evaluation side. So our organization is committed to evaluating the success of the Flex Funding for Families project. We're going to use the following methods of evaluating progress. So I've stated the objectives, and I've stated how we're going to know if we have achieved that objective. So a post-course survey, pre and post, would help me understand if the participants understand personal finance better than they did when they came to us. Or objective 2, 75 participants will have met at least one financial goal after 6 months. That might be a situation where you're using case notes to document when your clients meet goals. And then at the bottom here, in addition, we'll hold focus groups at 6-month intervals and use participant feedback to make adjustments that improve the program for clients and lead to greater financial stability. So that's going to be your formative assessment there. Moving on to everybody's favorite thing, the budget. Kind of the geek who likes playing with spreadsheets. So I actually enjoy playing with budgets and trying to figure out the best format for a budget. There are a lot of different ways that you can approach this. And again, there are as many ways to format or propose a budget as there are funders asking for that information. First, you want to research the actual costs of your request. Don't just, if you work in an organization, for example, who has caseworkers, don't just assume that you know what the salary of a caseworker is. Figure out what the average is or what the entry level is at your organization. You want to use accurate data or accurate budget information to the best of your ability. There are times that you're really going to have to estimate, and that makes sense too. But if there is specific data, just note where that came from. You want to use a line item calculation for each expense and show your work, at least on your internal notes. It may not be that that's what gets submitted to your funder, But as you're working, you know, in a Excel document, for example, just make those notes for yourself. A lot of them do ask for those calculation details, but not all. And then again, use actual amounts, not rounded amounts intended to pad the budget. So if you need 25 items at $37.50 a piece, I mean, you might want to, in this case, round to $938 rather than $37.50. But you don't want to say 25 items at $50 each if you really know that the things that you need are $37.50. Now, that said, I know with inflation, by the time you were to get funding and make this purchase, it might well be $50. And you could state that, but you just want to be clear about how you are calculating those numbers. Use a spreadsheet. I would really encourage that. You know, if you're not an expert, get help in how to use a spreadsheet, or sit down with your finance team and ask them to help you put together the budget. But if you do, you want to check and double check for math errors, typing errors, and formula errors. I certainly have made those before, and I've gotten budget revision requests back. So, and it was because I missed a formula. I had the wrong cell highlighted. So somebody was checking, which is good because it helped us make submit a better proposal. Again, get help from your CFO, treasurer, or another expert. And then your budget narrative and justification needs to show a clear line between your budget, the money that you're asking for, and what you propose to do with it. And I just made up a budget here just for illustration about, you know, this is one way you might think of formatting one. Whether or not this level of detail gets submitted to a funder is up to what that funder requests. You know, but here I've said where these numbers come from for the most part. I've said how they're connected to the project. Caseworker is going to work with clients to establish goals, provide ongoing support, and so on. I've got my calculations there, and then down at the bottom, I've got a total. Okay, so last thing with your program, or sorry, your proposal components, don't forget to follow all requirements related to formatting and page and character limits. If you don't, your application may not be considered no matter how amazing your project is. Technical review could kick you out. Or if your page limit is 15 pages and you've written 18, they may toss those last 3. So if those are sort of the, you know, maybe that's your logic model and it's really crucial for understanding your project. First of all, I wouldn't have that at the end of the proposal, but you know, they're not even going to look at those last 3 pages. So really be careful about that. You want to make sure that you're addressing all of the required elements and review criteria. Using headings, make it really easy for your reviewers because they get tired. Most of them are reviewing grants as something extra. It's not their full-time job. So make it as easy for them as possible. And look for sort of questions within questions. I see that a lot too. And your proposal should be readable. You know, you'd want to aim for sort of a 9th to 11th grade level for most. I understand that like highly technical applications are going to read like a lot of jargon. I know the evaluation section of the one proposal that was written by an external evaluator, I might as well have been reading Greek. So, but it made sense to them. But other than that, it should be very readable. And because your reviewers are going to come from a variety of backgrounds, they may be grant professionals like me. They may be subject matter experts. They could be medical professionals or attorneys. You never know who your reviewers are going to be. So some tips on managing and organizing your work. And again, this is largely just from my experience and like figuring out, and I'm still figuring out what works best on some of these. But I want to offer them to you, and you know, hopefully you can take something from here that's useful to you. So using a consistent file naming protocol, this is one I still tinker with some. But the more consistent it is as you're passing drafts back and forth, or when you go back next year and look at what you submitted the previous year, it's going to make more sense to you if you have at least a somewhat, excuse me, if you have a somewhat consistent file naming protocol. you want to save, at least save the things that I've listed here. And quick note on the data and budget and notes worksheets. What I usually do is I set up a workbook. I have different tabs and I try to label where the information came from. So if my budget has, if I'm looking for a specific educational tool or something like that, I usually try to put a link to where I found that information. Same thing with data, clearly describe it. I'll put the number of the data table from the US Census Bureau so that next year, if I need that information again to update, I know exactly where to go. You want to keep any templates for letters of support or commitment. If there's any critical correspondence between you and the funder, you and partners, drop that in a folder. And then I always create a final application folder. And I can go to that and say, this is the collection of items that we submitted. The other stuff in the folder are, those are drafts, those are editable. We can copy and paste them and revise them as needed. But that final application folder, that's what you submitted. And then you also obviously want to keep your grant agreements and amendments. And again, don't wait until the last day to explore a grant application portal. When you're approaching a grant deadline, the last thing you want is any surprises. Explore every page, explore every drop down. You might take screenshots if there's no other way to, to see what the drop down includes. Just make sure you've explored it. That's a lesson I've learned the hard way. Also remember that no matter how stellar your proposal was and how many people your project helps, funders make decisions on things that are beyond our control. This is one of the reasons that a lot of grant professionals don't talk about their success in terms of success rates, like X number of or X percentage of my proposals are funded, because a lot of it is beyond our control. A couple of years ago, a Kentucky funder, of course, COVID hit, and a lot of funders changed their priorities after applications had already been submitted. So I'd submitted a $15,000 priority, but then COVID happened, and that funder said, we really have a very urgent need in our state, and so we're shifting our priorities. So try again next year. That was completely out of my control. So as a grant professional, counting that against me is pretty unfair. It was a good fit funder. I had done my homework, but there's a lot that's outside of our control, including things like the fact that these are subjective decisions made by the reviewers. You don't want to get kicked out at technical review because you had too many pages or your formatting was off or you didn't address all the questions. But then it's going to go to an individual or panel review. And there may be a situation that, if it's a scoring sheet and you are above the threshold, the scoring threshold to be funded, let's say that's the top 15% of projects will be funded, for example, and you're in that, but all of those projects are in the same region and the funder wants to expand their footprint, or they want to have a good representation of kinds of organization or kinds of services. They may go below that threshold. If they notice, for example, we don't have any applications from Appalachia, but this one that is, just below our threshold is an Appalachian project. It didn't score quite as high, but we think it's really important to fund work in that region. So they may bump that up and dropping your proposal out of the scoring or out of the funding threshold. So don't take it as a failure, take it as learning, and just know that a lot of it's beyond your control. But if it is, take some time to celebrate. It's always great to get notice that your grant's been funded, whether it's for $2,500 or $2 million. So, do a little happy dance or however it is that you celebrate and start doing your project. And this will be really quick because I know we're about out of time, but some tips on getting started with your project. Very, very carefully review your terms and conditions. Go through with a highlighter, make notes, add deadlines to your calendar, invite relevant people, whether it's a financial report that's due, you need to invite your accountant or your CFO to that deadline and set reminders on there. On federally funded projects particularly, are there requirements relating to the hiring of grant funded staff? Like perhaps you need to be sure to interview a certain number of candidates. Perhaps if their salary is funded, more than 50% by one grant, they have to approve your pick for key staff hires. Specific requirements about subcontracting or subawarding. Data is a big one. Make sure you're paying close attention to what data you're going to be expected to collect and start that early. Make sure that you have those processes in place. And then a lot of foundations and federal government funders as well are going to have specific requirements about the acknowledgement of the award. Any materials printed using this funding must reference award number, blah, 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 from the US Department of Justice and so on. So pay careful attention to that, because you don't want to have to go back a year later and give back money that you spent printing flyers. I mean, those would be small amounts, hopefully, but because you didn't follow that really simple step. And then hold a kickoff meeting. If you have key partners, they would need to be there. You might have different meetings for internal staff, maybe the program director, the finance folks. If you have a data department, a compliance department, who are those key people inside your organization that are going to be integral to the success of your program? You may hold another one for key partners where you describe, this is what we got funding for, this is what we need to do, these are the first steps. We want to set some regular meetings and so on. You want to be clear about roles and responsibilities, both internally and with your partners. And then last here, discuss some ways to gather success stories, because you probably are going to want to seek other funding for, multiple sources of funding for the same project. And if there are ways that you can gather success stories, again, keeping in mind confidentiality, talk with your partners about how you might do that. I think it becomes really crucial. Also talking to individual donors and completing annual reports and that sort of thing. You want to have sort of a bank of success stories that you can draw on when you need to. And then lastly, we are all in this together. No one organization is going to do a project in isolation in their community. No one grant professional is going to put together a successful proposal for a project. We're all part of a big team, I think. So you can do what I cannot do. I can do what you cannot do. And together we can do great things. So keep that in mind. And lastly, is my contact information. Feel free to send me an email, find me on LinkedIn. I can, if you're on LinkedIn, I can direct you to some feeds from some other really helpful nonprofit organizations, Grant Professionals Association, and so on. So feel free to reach out. I hope that you've all gotten something out of this and feel better prepared to either go seek grant funding or be part of a team that does. And I'd love to take your questions. I know there's looks like 3 more in the Q&A. So, and Travis and Karen, is there anything that I've missed? I know that you've talked about getting copies of this to people. I know that you'll send an email at some point in the near future.
Yeah, Vicki, it'll be later today. I'll send out the email with the a PDF of that PowerPoint that you presented, as well as the links to those sites that you listed previously.
Okay.
I'll also list a link to the evaluation, which I hope everyone takes time to do. At the end, Travis will pop the link into the chat, and you can open that and do that before you leave. We would really appreciate it. Vicki, I think if we can go back up, it looks like we had one. We have 3 questions left unanswered. I'm a pastor in Louisville, and I'm thinking about becoming a grant writer to help write and consult local churches to get governmental funding where needed. Is this a need? Where is the biggest opportunity for service in the grant writing world?
Gosh, that's a good question. I'm gonna take the last part of that first. I mean, recently, of course, it's been COVID, but that's sort of a short-term thing. I think that diversity, equity, inclusion is a big thing right now. A lot of funders are shifting their focus to that because of all of the things that have been going on in the last 2 to 5 years. So if that's an area of expertise, I think working with organizations to petition or position themselves to do that. So that's not specifically grant writing, but it's more the grant readiness piece. Whether that's board development or strategic planning or reviewing policies and procedures with a DEI lens, that's a big need. Let's see, consulting local churches for government funds. It depends on what you're trying to fund. I mean, government funding is pretty specific in terms of what it funds. And when you're looking at faith-based organizations, you have to be very careful because you can't use government funding for any activities that require participants or participants to engage in any specifically religious activities. So you can be a faith-based organization, but the programs that you're operating with government funding, they can't require adherence to any specific religious tradition. I can't remember the verbiage off the top of my head. There's no proselytizing and so on. So you have to be very careful about that. So again, it's not to say that there aren't a lot of faith-based organizations that are involved in in social service work, whether it's homelessness or food banks or that sort of thing, but it can't be a requirement of participation that that beneficiaries adhere to any specific religious practice. So, so is there a need? I mean, yes, I think there's a need for highly qualified ethical grant professionals. I don't know about that specific niche other than to say, just, be careful of the projects that you're proposing.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Let's look at this. Based on your budget example, if the grant was for $100,000, will you only get $93,000?
That's also a great question. So the budget example that I showed, I think it was just over $93,000 was the request. And that was because I used, it was an example, but I used specific numbers. I didn't pad that budget in any way. It also wasn't entirely complete. I didn't ask for any administrative funds, but I think that the question is about, if a foundation says that we fund requests up to $100,000, but we only request 93, will we only get 93? And I'll say, in all likelihood, yes. I know that there are some people that would say, well, you should ask for the full 100,000, but if that's not what your project requires, don't request it, because I really do believe that we're all in this together. There are going to be other organizations doing really great work that could use that other $7,000. The other thing I'll say, and this hasn't happened to me with a grant of that size, but with smaller grants, I have requested something in the range of $6,000, and it was a community foundation, and they were able to generate more funds during that fiscal year than they anticipated. So they gave all their grantees an extra $2,000. So I think that being transparent about what your project needs is really important, because we're not here in a vacuum, and other agencies could use that funding, and you don't want to be inaccurate.
Thank you. And I did skip over one. I think this might be the last one here.
Yeah.
Did the course you took to become certified cover only nonprofits, or does it cover other type of grants such as personal?
Okay. Good question. So it wasn't a course that I took to become certified. My certification is you have to have worked in the field. You have to have a track record of successful grant seeking. So it's not a course. It's not a certificate of completion. It's a credential. It's accredited by an accredited, I can never say this word, accreditation body. I think I got it right. So let's see. Does it only cover nonprofits? Not necessarily, because there are municipalities that also request funding. I mean, I guess they're a nonprofit as well, but there are also small businesses or research institutions that are for-profit entities that request government funding, particularly in scientific fields, I would argue, or research fields. It does not cover personal grants. The only things that go to individual people that I know of that are grants are for education, Pell grants and such. The federal government, Department of Justice, say, doesn't offer grants. There might be, let's see, like small business loans. So there may be no interest loans and that kind of thing that could go to individuals, but I don't know of any grants that just give grants to an individual. If somebody else does, please speak up. I do not know it. Karen, has that been your experience too? I know that you guys have a really wide range of programming at Kentucky River Foothills.
Yes, we have a wide range. And so one of the things that we're really good at is there's a lot of staff on this training today, and we do have a contract grant writer. And so she shares time with us in another nonprofit. And we have several staff too that are well equipped in writing grants as small as $5,000 and up to in the hundreds, thousands of dollars. And so, and we're all, as program directors and managers, equipped in grant reporting, truly making sure that the money awarded to us was spent in the way that it was intended. And so we do a variety of trainings internally throughout the year to make sure that all staff spend the money the way that it was intended and are really careful about how we spend our money.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, grants for individuals or personal grants are not, I think there's a lot of misinformation about grants. I mean, there's obviously public assistance, but those are not grants. Again, grants are not free money. They're pretty high expectations of how projects are carried out with grant funding most of the time. But they're going to fund projects or organizations or government entities, sometimes businesses, small businesses, and so on, but not individuals. So I hope I've answered that question in the way that you were asking. And if there are any last questions, looks like we have 2 minutes. I really appreciate everybody spending a couple of hours with us. I hope that if you never write a grant in your life, I hope that you have learned something about how to be a better project partner, a better team member for the programs that your organizations are working on. I know you're all doing great work in the community, and I really do feel like this is a collaborative effort on all of our parts. I mean, yes, we may compete for grant funding sometimes, but it's really laying good foundations in our community, and we're all doing the same good work ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I do want to remind everyone that we're going to send an email later today that will include a copy of your presentation, as well as all of the links that you dropped in the chat right at break. I'll let Travis chime in, but I just want to thank you for creating this presentation for us. It is one of the best grant trainings that I have attended, and that's saying a lot. I was really learned a lot myself. So very top notch, and your comments and stories were very helpful. And I do hope that you can join us again.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I really appreciate the opportunity.
I just want to echo what Karen said and say thank you very much. We did have a few people that asked about the actual video. So once Zoom gets finished processing it, we will make that video available on our YouTube page. Just so everyone knows that if you want to share the content from today, that'll be available.
And I hope that this is if this training helped you receive a grant funded, let us know about it. We would love to know how this grant helped in the next couple of months. So please shoot us an email and let us know if what you were funded for and how much.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd love to know that too. So, yeah, I feel like elevating, all of our work in funders' eyes is really important, and in the community's eyes too. So go out there and do good things.
Absolutely. Well, if there's nothing else, I'm going to thank you all for spending time with us again today. We will see you next time. Thank you.
So thanks, everybody. Have a great day.